The night was colder than usual in Ravenwood, a small town nestled deep in the woods. The town had a quiet, almost eerie charm to it, with its narrow streets lined with old, Victorian-style houses and dense forests surrounding it on all sides. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and where secrets lingered in the shadows. Inside the Ravenwood Police Department, Officer Mark Hansen sat at his desk, his feet propped up on the edge, staring at the flickering computer screen. The station was small, with only a handful of officers working the night shift. It was the kind of place where nothing much ever happened, just the occasional speeding ticket or a call about a lost dog. But tonight, Mark felt a sense of unease he couldn't shake, as if something was brewing just beyond the edge of town. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, the hands inching toward midnight. Mark leaned back in his chair, stretching his arms over his head. The station was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the hum of the fluorescent lights breaking the silence. He glanced over at the dispatch desk, where Officer Linda Collins was sitting, her eyes glued to a crossword puzzle. "You ever get the feeling that something's not right?" Mark asked, his voice cutting through the stillness. Linda looked up from her puzzle, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Mark said, shrugging. "Just a feeling. Like something's off." Linda chuckled, shaking her head. "You're just bored, Hansen. It's another dead night in Ravenwood. Nothing ever happens here." Mark smiled, but the feeling of unease persisted. He turned his attention back to his computer, trying to distract himself with paperwork. But before he could get too far, the phone on his desk rang, startling him. He picked up the receiver. "Ravenwood Police Department, Officer Hansen speaking." For a moment, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Then, a faint, raspy voice whispered, "Help me." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "Who is this? What's going on?" "Please," the voice continued, barely audible. "You have to help me." "Where are you?" Mark asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "What's your name?" But before the caller could answer, the line went dead. Mark stared at the phone, his mind racing. He had dealt with prank calls before, but this felt different, real. The fear in the voice had been palpable, sending a chill down his spine. "What was that about?" Linda asked, noticing the concerned look on Mark's face. "I'm not sure," Mark replied, setting the phone down. "Somebody asking for help, but the line cut out before I could get any details." "Probably just a prank," Linda said, though her voice wavered slightly. "You know how kids are." "Maybe," Mark said, though he wasn't convinced. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He checked the call log on his computer, but there was no number listed, just a blank space where the caller ID should have been. Mark frowned. "There's no record of the call. It's like it never happened." Linda's expression grew more serious. "That's strange." Mark nodded. "Yeah, it is." Before they could discuss it further, the phone rang again. Mark quickly picked it up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Ravenwood Police Department, Officer Hansen speaking." Again, there was only silence on the other end. Mark held his breath, waiting. Then, the same voice whispered, "He's coming for me." Mark's grip tightened on the phone. "Who's coming for you? Where are you?" But once again, the line went dead. Mark slammed the receiver down, frustration and fear gnawing at him. "We need to trace these calls," he said, looking over at Linda. She nodded, already reaching for the phone to call the phone company. "I'll get them on the line, see if they can help us out." Mark paced the small office, his mind racing. There was something about the calls that unsettled him, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The fear in the caller's voice had been genuine, and the fact that the calls couldn't be traced only added to the mystery. Linda spoke to the phone company for a few minutes before hanging up, her face pale. They said there's no record of any calls coming into the station tonight. Mark stopped in his tracks. What do you mean? I mean, according to them, our phone hasn't rung once tonight. But we both know that's not true. Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. This doesn't make any sense. How can the calls not exist? I don't know, Linda said, her voice trembling slightly. But whatever's going on, it's not normal. The phone rang again, and both officers jumped. Mark snatched the receiver, his hand shaking. Who is this? What do you want? The voice on the other end was even fainter this time, as if the caller was struggling to speak. He's here. Mark's blood ran cold. Who's there? Tell me where you are, and I'll send help. But the only response was the sound of labored breathing, followed by a chilling whisper, He's coming for you, too. The line went dead again. Mark stared at the phone, his mind racing. Whoever this caller was, they were in serious danger, and now, it seemed, so were he and Linda. We need to find out where these calls are coming from, Mark said, his voice firm. There has to be a way to trace them. Linda nodded, fear evident in her eyes. I'll call the phone company again, see if they can do anything. As Linda made the call, Mark sat back down at his desk, trying to piece together what was happening. The calls were unlike anything he had ever encountered, and the fact that they couldn't be traced only added to the mystery. It was as if the calls were coming from nowhere, or from somewhere they couldn't reach. The phone rang again, and this time, both officers hesitated. Mark took a deep breath and answered. Ravenwood Police Department, Officer Hanson speaking. This time, there was no voice on the other end, only the sound of static, like a distant radio station struggling to come through. Then, faintly, he heard what sounded like a door creaking open, followed by a low, guttural growl. Hello? Mark called out, his voice wavering. Is anyone there? But the line went dead once more. Mark set the phone down, his heart racing. Did you hear that? Linda nodded, her face pale. What the hell is going on? Before Mark could answer, the lights in the station flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a moment before coming back on. The sudden change sent a jolt of fear through him. Ravenwood had its share of power outages, but this felt different, like something was deliberately messing with them. We need to check the station, Mark said, grabbing his flashlight. If someone's playing a prank on us, they might be nearby. Linda nodded, grabbing her own flashlight. The two officers moved cautiously through the station, checking each room one by one. The air felt thick with tension, and every creak and groan of the old building made their hearts race. But as they moved through the station, they found nothing, no sign of anyone, and no explanation for the strange calls. Just as they were about to return to the office, the phone rang again, echoing through the empty hallways. Mark and Linda exchanged a glance before hurrying back to the desk. Mark picked up the receiver, his hand trembling. Ravenwood Police Department, he said, his voice unsteady. This time, the voice on the other end was different, deeper, more menacing. You can't stop him. Mark's blood ran cold. Who are you? What do you want? The voice chuckled, a low, sinister sound that sent chills down his spine. He's already here. The line went dead. Mark set the phone down, his heart pounding in his chest. We need to get out of here, he said, looking at Linda. Something's not right. Linda nodded, her fear evident. But what if someone really needs our help? Mark hesitated, torn between his duty as a police officer and the overwhelming sense of danger that hung in the air. But before he could decide, the lights flickered again, plunging the station into darkness. For a moment, neither of them moved, their breath caught in their throats. Then, from somewhere deep within the station, they heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming closer. Mark's grip tightened on his flashlight. "Who's there?" The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the darkness, a voice whispered, "He's coming for you." The sound sent a jolt of terror through Mark. He turned to Linda. "We need to get out of here, now." But as they moved toward the exit, the door to the station slammed shut with a deafening crash, sealing them inside. Mark's heart raced as he tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "We're trapped," Linda said, her voice shaking. Mark took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. There has to be another way out. But before they could move, the footsteps started again, closer this time. The sound echoed through the station, growing louder with each step. Mark shined his flashlight toward the source of the sound, but the beam only cut through the darkness a few feet ahead. The sense of dread grew stronger as the footsteps approached, and Mark could feel the air grow colder, as if the temperature had dropped suddenly. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a man, or at least it had been once. His clothes were tattered and stained, his skin pale and rotting. His eyes were hollow, and his mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, his eyes fixed on Mark and Linda. Mark's heart raced as he backed away, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. What are you?" The figure's grin widened, revealing yellowed, decaying teeth. "You can't stop him," it rasped, its voice filled with malice. "He's already here." Mark felt a surge of panic as the figure took another step forward. He shined his flashlight directly at it, but the light seemed to pass through the figure as if it wasn't entirely there. Linda's voice trembled as she whispered, "We have to get out of here, Mark. We have to go now." But the figure was between them and the only exit. Mark's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out, but the sense of dread was overwhelming, clouding his thoughts. The figure took another step closer, its eyes fixed on Mark. "You can't run," it hissed. "You can't hide." Mark's breath came in short, panicked gasps as the figure reached out toward him, its hand cold and clammy. He recoiled, stumbling backward into the desk. His flashlight slipped from his grasp, clattering to the floor and rolling away, plunging the room into darkness. Linda screamed, and Mark felt a surge of adrenaline as he reached for his sidearm. But before he could draw it, the figure lunged at him, its cold hands wrapping around his throat. Mark struggled, trying to break free, but the figure's grip was impossibly strong. His vision blurred as the air was squeezed from his lungs, and he could feel the icy chill of death creeping over him. But just as he felt himself slipping away, there was a blinding flash of light. The figure recoiled, releasing its grip on Mark and retreating into the shadows with an unearthly scream. Mark collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath. He looked up to see Linda standing over him, her flashlight shining brightly, the beam cutting through the darkness. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark nodded weakly, still struggling to catch his breath. I think so." But the sense of danger was still there, pressing down on them like a weight. The figure was gone, but the air was still thick with malevolence, and Mark knew that they weren't safe yet. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice hoarse. "There has to be another way." Linda nodded, helping him to his feet. They moved quickly through the station, checking every door and window, but each one was locked tight, as if the building itself was conspiring to keep them trapped inside. As they searched, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The darkness seemed to close in around them, and the cold seeped into their bones, sapping their strength. Finally, they found a small window in the back of the station that hadn't been locked. It was narrow, but just wide enough for them to squeeze through. "You go first," Mark said, helping Linda up to the window. She hesitated, glancing back at him. "What about you?" "I'll be right behind you," Mark promised. Linda nodded and climbed through the window, landing outside in the cold night air. Mark followed, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he climbed through the window, he felt a cold hand grasp his ankle, yanking him back inside. He cried out, struggling to free himself, but the grip was like iron. "Mark!" Linda screamed, reaching out to grab him. Mark kicked at the hand with all his strength, and finally, it released him. He scrambled through the window, landing hard on the ground outside. Linda pulled him to his feet, and they ran, not daring to look back. The night was cold and still, the air thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. But all Mark could think about was the figure in the station, and the way its hollow eyes had seemed to stare straight into his soul. They ran until they reached the edge of town, where the lights of the main street offered a small measure of safety. Only then did they stop, panting and exhausted, their hearts still racing with fear. What was that?" Linda asked, her voice trembling. Mark shook his head, still trying to process what had happened. "I don't know," he said. "But whatever it wasn't human." Linda nodded, her face pale. "Do you think it's still out there?" Mark glanced back toward the dark silhouette of the police station in the distance, shrouded in shadows. "I don't know," he said quietly. "But I think we need to find out." They headed back to the station the next morning, after the sun had risen and the town had returned to its usual sleepy calm. The station looked different in the daylight, less threatening, more like the quiet, familiar place they had always known. But as they stepped inside, the memory of the previous night came flooding back. The air was still cold, and the sense of unease lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over the building. Mark and Linda cautiously made their way through the station, checking each room. Everything was as they had left it, no signs of struggle, no evidence of the figure that had attacked them. It was as if the events of the night before had been nothing more than a bad dream. But when they reached the office, they found the phone lying on the floor, the receiver off the hook. Mark's heart skipped a beat as he reached down to pick it up. As soon as he did, the phone rang, the sudden sound startling both of them. Mark hesitated for a moment before answering. "Ravenwood Police Department," he said, his voice trembling. There was a brief pause, then a familiar, raspy voice whispered, "He's still here." The line went dead. Mark stared at the phone, his hand shaking. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Linda nodded, her face pale with fear. They turned to leave, but before they could reach the door, it slammed shut with a deafening crash, sealing them inside once again. The voice on the other end was faint, barely audible over the static. "He's coming for you," it whispered. "And there's nothing you can do to stop him." The line went dead. Mark set the phone down, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that they were in grave danger, and that whatever was haunting the station wasn't going to stop until it had claimed them.